Okay. Enter the History of Psych, Chapter 5. Empiricism, Sensationalism, and Positivism. Descartes was so influenced that most of the philosophies that developed after him were reactions to some aspect of his work. The British and French philosophers denied Descartes' contention, and some ideas were innate, saying instead that all ideas were derived from experience. These philosophers attempted to explain the function of the mind as Newton had explained the functioning of the universe. That is, they sought a few principles or laws that could account for all human mental experience. German philosophers made an active mind central to their conception of human nature. Instead of envisioning a mind as a simply recorded and stored sensory experiences, they saw the mind as actively transforming the sensory information, whereby giving the information meaning it otherwise would not have. For these German rationalists, knowing the operation of the active mind was vital to determining how humans confront and understand the world. Scattered throughout Europe, the Romantic philosophers rebelled against the views of empiricists and rationalists. According to the Romantics, both these philosophers concentrated on one aspect of humans and neglected others. The Romantics urged a focus on the total person, a focus that included two aspects of other philosophies, minimized human emotions and the uniqueness of each individual. After Descartes, and to a large extent because of him, the philosophies of empiricism, rationalism, and romanticism took center stage. In this chapter, we focus on British empiricism, French sensationalism, and French sensationalism. We will review German rationalism in Chapter 6 and Romanticism in Chapter 7. British empiricism. An empiricist is anyone who believes that knowledge is derived from experience. Empiricism, then, is a philosophy that stresses the importance of experience in the attainment of knowledge. The term experience, in the definition of empiricism, complicates matters because there are many types of experience. There's an inner experience, such as dreams, imagings, fantasies, and a variety of emotions. Also, when one thinks logically, such as during mathematical deduction, one is having mental experiences. However, there's a general agreement, to exclude such inner experiences from a definition of empiricism and refer exclusively to sensory experience. Yet even after focusing on sensory experience, there is still a problem because the implication is that any philosopher who claims sensory experience to be vital in attaining knowledge is the empiricist. And if that were true, Descartes would be called an empiricist. Because for him, many ideas came from the sensory experience, thus acknowledging the importance of sensory experience alone does not qualify one as an empiricist. What then is an empiricist? In this text, we're going to use the following definition of empiricism. Empiricism is the epistemology that asserts that the evidence of sense constitutes the primary data of all knowledge, that knowledge cannot exist unless this evidence has first been gathered, and that all subsequent intellectual processes must use this evidence, and only this evidence, in framing valid propositions about the real world. It is important to highlight a number of terms in Robinson's definition. First, this definition asserts the sensory experience constitutes the primary data of all knowledge. It does not say that the experience alone constitutes knowledge. And second, it asserts that knowledge cannot exist until sensory evidence has first been gathered. So for an empiricist, attaining knowledge begins with sensory experience. And third, all subsequent intellectual processes must focus on sensory experience in formulating propositions about the world. Thus, it is not the recognition of mental processes that distinguishes the empiricist from the rationalist. Rather, it is what thought processes are focused on. Again, the most epistemological approach used sensory experience as a part of their explanation of the origins of knowledge. For the empiricist, however, sensory experience is of supreme importance. Thomas Hobbes. Although he followed the tradition of William of Ockham and Francis Bacon, Thomas Hobbes is sometimes referred to as the founder of British empiricism. Hobbes was educated at Oxford and was friends with both Galileo and Descartes. He also served as Bacon's secretary for a short time. Hobbes was born in Malmesbury, Wiltshire, England. He often joked that he and Fear were born twins because his mother attributed his premature birth to her learning of the approaching Spanish Armada. Hobbes' father, an Anglican vicar, got into a fight in the doorway of his church and thereafter disappeared. The care of his children was left to a prosperous brother who eventually provided Hobbes with an Oxford education. But Hobbes claimed that he learned little of value from that venture. Hobbes noted that Oxford had a strong Puritan tradition, but also had an abundance of drunkenness, wantonness, gambling, and other such vices. Hobbes lived a long time, productive and influential life. He played tennis until about age 70, and at 87 he wrote his autobiography. At 86 he published a translation called The Iliad and the Odyssey. Just for something to do. Prior to his death, he amused himself by having his friends prepare epitaphs for him. Hobbes achieved great fame in his lifetime. Indeed, like Bernard Shaw, by the time of his death, he had become almost an English institution. Humans as machines. Hobbes did not become serious about philosophy until about age 40, when he came across Euclid's Elements. This book convinced him that humans could be understood by using techniques of geometry. That is, starting with a few undeniable premises, and a number of undeniable conclusions could be drawn. The question of what premises to begin with, an answer came from Galileo. After visiting Galileo in 1635, Hobbes became convinced that the universe consisted only of matter and motion, and that both could be understood in terms of mechanistic principles. Why, asked Hobbes, could not humans too be viewed as machines consisting of nothing but matter and motion? Galileo was able to explain the motion of physical objects in terms of the external forces acting on them, that is, without appealing to the inner states or essences. Are not humans part of nature, wondered Hobbes, and if so, cannot their behavior also be explained by the matter in motion? This became the self-evident truth that Hobbes needed to apply, the deductive method of geometry. Humans were machines. Humans were viewed as machines, functioning within a larger machine, the universe. For seeing life is but motion of limbs. For what is the heart but a spring? And the nerves but so many strings, and the joints but so many wheels, giving motion to the whole body. It is interesting to note that although Hobbes was a close friend of Bacon, that he himself had considerable reputation. Hobbes was never asked to join a prestigious British Royal Society founded in 1660. The reason was that the society was dominated by Baconians, and Hobbes had nothing but contempt for Bacon's inductive method. He accused the Baconians of spending too much time on gadgets and experiments, and of preferring their eyes, ears, and fingertips to their brains. Instead, Hobbes chose the deductive method, the method of Galileo and Descartes. With Hobbes, we have the first serious attempt to apply ideas and techniques of Galileo to human study. Government and human instincts. Like many of the philosophers we will see in this chapter, Hobbes's primary interest was politics. He was thoroughly convinced that the best form of government was an absolute monarchy. He believed that humans were naturally aggressive, selfish, and greedy. Therefore, democracy was dangerous because it gives too much latitude on these negative natural tendencies. Only when people and the church are subservient to the monarch, he felt, there could be law and order. Without such regulation, human life would be solitary, poor, brutish, and short. Hobbes's infamous conclusion, Homo homini lupus, man is a wolf to man, was later quoted sympathetically by Schopenhauer and Freud. It is according to Hobbes, fear of death motivates humans to create social order. In other words, civilization is created as a matter of self-defense. Each of us must be discouraged from committing crimes on the other, unless inferred with, humans could be selfishly seek power over others so as to guarantee the satisfaction of their own personal needs. I put for a general inclination that all mankind a perpetual and restless desire of power after power, and the ceaseth only in death. The monarch was seen by Hobbes as the first final arbitrator in all matters of law, morals, and religion, and the freedom of a person consisted only in those activities not forbidden by law. The laws are determined and enforced by the monarch. Hobbes offended all types of Christians by saying that the church should be subservient to the state and that all human actions could be explained mechanically. Hobbes's most famous work, Leviathan, was mainly a political treatise, an attempt to explain and justify the rule by an absolute monarch. Hobbes began Leviathan with his views on psychology because it was his belief that that to govern effectively, the monarch needed to have an understanding of human nature. Leviathan became viewed as a work of an atheist, and in 1666 a motion was made in Parliament to burn Hobbes as a heretic. The plague of 1665 and the Great Fire of London the following year were believed by many to be God's revenge on England for harboring Hobbes. King Charles II came to his rescue, however, and as mentioned before, Hobbes went on to live long, productive life and died at the age of 91. Hobbes's empiricism. Although Hobbes rejected Bacon's inductive method in favor of the deductive method, he did agree with Bacon on the importance of the sensory experience. The origin of all thoughts is that which we can sense. For there is no conception in a man's mind which hath not at first, totally or by parts, been begotten among the organs of sense. The rest are derived from that original. Although Hobbes accepted Descartes' deductive method, he rejected his concept of innate ideas. For Hobbes, all ideas came from experience, especially from the sensory experience. Following the tradition of Democritus, Hobbes was also a materialist, because all that exists is matter and motion. Hobbes thought it is absurd to postulate a non-material mind, as Descartes had done. All so-called mental phenomena could be explained by sense experience. That result when the motion of external bodies stimulates the sense receptors, thus causing internal motion. What others refer to as mind for Hobbes was nothing more than the sum total of a person's thinking activities. That is, a series of motions within the individual concerning the mind-body problem. Hobbes was a physical monist. He denied the existence of the non-material mind. Explanation of psychological phenomena. Attention was explained by the fact that as long as sense organisms retain the motion caused by certain external objects, they cannot respond to others. The availability of mental imagery, for Hobbes, or imagination, was explained by the fact that the sense impressions decay over time, as did memory. So, imagination and memory are but one thing which for divers consideration hath divers names. Dreams have the same origin, the imagination, the imaginations of them that sleep are those that we call dreams, and also all other imaginations have been before either totally or by parcels in the sense. The reason that dreams are typically so vivid because during sleep there are no new sensory impressions to compete with imagination. Hobbes argued that external objects are not only produce sense impressions but also influence the vital functions of the body. Those incoming impressions that facilitate vital functions are experienced as pleasurable, and the person seeks to preserve them or to seek them out. Controversially, sense impressions incompatible with the vital functions are experienced as painful, and the person seeks to terminate or avoid them. Human behavior, then, is motivated by appetite, the seeking or maintaining of pleasurable experiences, and aversion, the avoidance or termination of painful experiences. In other words, Hobbes accepted a hedonistic theory of motivation. According to Hobbes, we use terms like love and good to describe things that please us, and terms such as hate and evil to describe things which we have an aversion. By equating good with pleasure and evil or bad with pain, Hobbes was taking a clear stand on the moral issue. Having insinuated this identity, Hobbes had both stated and explained moral relativism. Saying it right. There was no objective or moral properties, but what seemed good was what pleased an individual or was good for him. Hobbes' deterministic view of people, of human behavior, there was no place for free will. People may believe that they are choosing, because at any given moment one may be confronted with a number of appetites and aversions, and therefore they may conflict with the tendencies to act. For Hobbes, will was defined as the action tendency that prevails when a number of such tendencies exist simultaneously. What appears to be the choice is nothing more than a verbal label that we use to describe the actions and aversions we experience while interacting with the environment. Once a prevalent behavioral tendency emerges, freedom is simply a condition of having no hindrance to the securing of what one wants. Complex thought processes. Hobbes also attempted to explain the trains of thought, by which he meant the tendency of one thought to follow another. The question was how such a phenomenon occurs. And Hobbes' answer reintroduced the law of contiguity, first proposed by Aristotle. That is, events that are experienced together are remembered together and are subsequently thought of together. All British empiricists who followed Hobbes accepted the concept of association as their explanation as to why mental events are experienced or remembered in particular order. To summarize Hobbes' position, we can say that he was a materialist because he believed that all existence was physical. He was a mechanist because he believed that the universe and everything in it, including humans, were machines. And he was a determinist because he believed that all activity, including human behavior, is caused by forces acting on physical objects. He was an empiricist because he believed that all knowledge was derived from sensory experience, and he was a hedonist because he believed that human behavior, as well as the behavior of non-human animals, was motivated by the seeking of pleasure and avoidance of pain. Although we will see that not all empiricists that followed Hobbes were as materialistic or mechanistic as he was, that all joined him in denying the existence of innate ideas. And that's it for Hobbes. So John Locke, 1632 to 1704, was born in Riddington in Somerset, England, 6 years after the death of Francis Bacon. His father was a Puritan, a small landowner, and an attorney. Locke was a 17-year-old student at Westminster School when on January 30th, 1649, King Charles I was executed as a traitor for his country. This execution, which Locke may have witnessed, took place in a courtyard of Whitehall Palace, which was close to Locke's school. Locke was born 10 years before the outbreak of civil war, and he lived through this great rebellion that was so important to English history. It was at least partially due to the zeitgeist then that Locke, as well as several of his fellow students, were to develop a lifelong interest in politics. Indeed, Locke was to become the most influential political philosopher in the post-Renaissance Europe. In 1652, Locke, at age 20, obtained a scholarship from Oxford University, which he earned his bachelor's degree in 1656 and his master's degree in 1658. His first publication was a poem that he wrote when he was an undergrad, as a tribute to Oliver Cromwell. Locke remained at Oxford for 30 years, having academic appointments in Greek, rhetoric, and moral philosophy. He also studied medicine. In his third attempt, he finally attained a doctorate in medicine in 1674. It was thought his medical studies that Locke met Robert Boyle, 1627 to 1691, who influenced him greatly. Boyle was one of the founders of the Royal Society of Modern Chemistry. Locke became Boyle's friend, student, and research assistant. From Boyle, Locke learned that physical objects were composed of minute corpuscles that have just a few intrinsic qualities. These corpuscles I can't say this word. Okay, minute corpuscles that have very few intrinsic qualities. These corpuscles can be experienced in many numbers and arrangements. Some arrangements resulted in the experience of primary qualities, and some in the experience of secondary qualities. We will see shortly that Boyle's corpuscular hypothesis strongly influenced Locke's philosophy. Locke became a member of the Royal Society, and a member performed some studies and demonstrations in chemistry and meteorology. Newton was only 10 years old when Locke arrived at Oxford, but in 1689 the two men met, and Locke referred to him as the incomparable Mr. Newton. Locke corresponded with Newton for the rest of his life, and primarily on theological matters. Among Locke's lesser-known works were the editing of Boyle's General History of Air, an edition of Aesop's Fables designed to help children learn Latin, and a book on money and interest rates. His most famous work, however, was and the most important to psychology, was an essay concerning human understanding. Locke worked on the essay for 17 years, and it was finally published when Locke was almost 60 years old. After its original publication, Locke revised the essay several times and eventually went into 5 editions. The 5th edition appeared posthumously in 1706, and it is on its final edition that most of what follows is based. After publishing the essay, Locke wrote prolifically on such topics as education, government, economics, and Christianity. Voltaire, 1694 to 1778, greatly admired Locke and did much to create a positive impression of Locke on the continent, especially in France. Although Hobbes was clearly an empiricist, it was Locke who shaped the most subsequent British empiricism. For example, most of the British empiricists followed Locke in accepting a mind-body dualism, that he rejected Hobbes's physical monism, whereas Hobbes equated mental images with the motions in the brain that were caused by external motions acting on some sense receptors. Locke was content to say that somehow sensory stimulation caused ideas. Early in essay, Locke washed his hands of the question as to how something physical could cause something mental. It just did. Yeah, exactly. Opposition to innate ideas. Locke's essay was in part a protest against Descartes' philosophy. It was not Descartes' dualism that Locke attacked, but his notion of innate ideas. Despite Hobbes' efforts, the notion of innate ideas was still very popular in Locke's time. Especially influential was the belief that God had instilled in humans innate ideas of morality. Locke observed that if the mind contains such innate ideas, then all humans should have those same ideas. And clearly, they do not. Humans, he said, are not born with any innate ideas, whether they be moral, theological, logical, or mathematical. Where then do all the ideas that humans come from? Locke's famous answer is as follows. Let us then suppose the mind to be, as we say, white paper. Avoid all characters without any ideas. How come it to be furnished? Where hence comes it? By that vast store which the busy and boundless fancy of man was painted on it, with an almost endless variety. Where hence has it all the materials of reason and knowledge? And to this I answer in one word, from experience. In that all our knowledge is founded, and form that is ultimately derives itself. Our observations employed either about external sensible objects or about internal operations of our minds perceived and reflected on by ourselves. is that which supplies our understanding with all the materials of thinking. These two are the foundations of knowledge, from whence all the ideas we have, or can naturally have, do spring. Sensation and reflection. For Locke, an idea was simply a mental image that could be employed while thinking. Whatsoever the mind perceives in itself or in the immediate object of perception, thought or understanding, that I call idea. For Locke, all ideas come from either sensation or reflection. That is, ideas result either by direct sensory stimulation or by reflection on the remnants of prior sensory stimulation. Thus, the source of all ideas is sensation. But the ideas obtained by sensation can be acted on and rearranged by operations in the mind. Whereby giving rise to new ideas. The operations of the mind can bring to bear on the ideas furnished by sensation include perception, thinking, doubting, believing, reasoning, knowing, and willing. Locke is often said to have postulated a passive mind that is simply received and stored ideas caused by sensory stimulation. This was true, however, only of sensations. Once the ideas furnished by sensation are in the mind, they can be actively transformed into an almost endless variety of other ideas by the mental operations involved in reflection. It is important to note, however, that Locke insisted that all knowledge is ultimately derived from sensory experience. Although the contents of the mind were derived from sensory stimulation, the operations of the mind are part of human nature and are innate. As an empiricist, Locke opposed the notion of specific innate ideas, but not innate operations. Ideas and emotions, simple ideas. Whether the sensation or reflection constitute the atom or corpuscles of experience, because they cannot be derived or analyzed further into other ideas. Complex ideas, however, are composites of simple ideas and therefore can be analyzed into their component parts, simple ideas. When the operations of the mind are applied to simple ideas through reflection, complex ideas are formed. That is, through which operations as comparing, remembering, discriminating, combining, enlarging, abstracting, and reasoning, simple ideas are combined into a complex ones. As Locke explained, simple ideas, the materials of our knowledge, are suggested and furnished to the mind only by sensation and reflection. When the understanding is once stored with the simple ideas, it has great power to repeat, compare, and unite them, even to an almost infinite variety, and can make at pleasure new complex ideas. But it is not in the power of the most exalted wit or enlarged understanding, by any of the quickness or variety of thought, to invent or frame one new simple idea in the mind, not taken in by the ways before mentioned, nor can any force of the understanding destroy those that are there. I would have anyone try to fancy any taste which had never affected his palate, or frame an idea of a scent that he has never smelt. And when he can do this, I will also conclude that a blind man hath ideas of colors, and a deaf man true, distinct notions of sound. The mind, then, can neither create nor destroy ideas, but it can arrange existing ideas in almost infinite number of configurations. Locke also maintained that feelings of pleasures or pain accompany both simple and complex ideas. He believed that the other passions, emotions like love, desire, joy, hatred, sorrow, anger, fear, despair, envy, shame, and hope, were all derived from two basic feelings of pleasure and pain. Things that cause pleasure are good, and things that cause pain are evil. Note the similarity to Hobbes. For Locke, the greatest good was the freedom to think pleasurable thoughts. Like Hobbes, the theory of human motivation was hedonistic. His theory of human motivation was hedonistic because he maintained that humans are motivated for the search for pleasure and the avoidance of pain. For Locke, the information that the senses provided was stuff the mind thought about and had emotional reactions towards. So primary and secondary qualities. The distinction between primary and secondary qualities is the distinction that several early Greeks and later Galileo made between what is physically present and what is experienced psychologically. However, it was Locke's friend and teacher Robert Boyle who introduced the term primary qualities and secondary qualities, and Locke borrowed the terms from him. Unfortunately, primary and secondary qualities have been defined in two distinctly different ways throughout the centuries. One way has been to define primary qualities as attributes of physical reality and secondary qualities as attributes of subjective or subconscious reality. That is, primary qualities refer to the actual attributions of physical objects or events, but secondary qualities refer to psychological experiences that have no counterparts in the physical world. We covered this approach in our discussion of Galileo in Chapter 4, but Boyle and Locke took a different path. For them, both primary and secondary qualities referred to characteristics of the physical world. What distinguished them was the type of psychological experience they caused. Following Boyle, Locke referred to any aspect of a physical object that had the power to produce an idea as quality. Primary qualities have the power to create in us ideas that correspond to actual physical attributes of physical objects. For example, ideas of solidarity, extension, shape, motion, and rest and quantity. With primary qualities, there is a match between what is physically present and what is experienced psychologically. The secondary qualities of objects also have the power to produce ideas, but the ideas they produce do not correspond to anything in the physical world. The ideas produced by secondary qualities include those of color, sound, temperature, and taste. Locke's paradox of the basins dramatically demonstrates the nature of ideas caused by secondary qualities. Suppose we ask if is temperature a characteristic of the physical world? In other words, is it not safe to assume that objects in the physical world are hot or cold or somewhere in between? Looked at in this way, temperature would be a primary quality. Locke beckoned his readers to take 3 water basins. One containing cold water, was basin A, one containing hot water, basin B, and the other containing warm water, basin C. If a person places one hand in basin A and the other in basin B, one hand will feel hot and the other cold, supporting the contention that hot and cold are properties of water. That is, the temperature is a primary quality. Next, Locke instructed the reader to place both hands in basin C, which contains the warm water. To the hand that was previously in basin A, cold water, the water in basin C will feel hot, and to the hand that was previously in basin B, hot water, the water will feel cold. Even though the temperature of the water in the basin C is physically the same in both hands, thus Locke demonstrated the experience of hot and cold depended on the experiencing person. The temperature, therefore, reflected a secondary quality. For Locke, the important point was some of our physiological experiences reflect in the physical world as it actually was, those experiences caused by primary qualities, and some did not, these experiences caused by secondary qualities. He did not say, as Galileo had, that subjective reality was inferior to physical reality. For Locke, subjective reality could be studied as objectively as physical reality. And so he set out to do just that. Association of ideas. Associationism, as a psychological theory which takes association to be the fundamental principle of mental life, in terms of which even a higher thought processes are to be explained. According to this definition, it is possible to reject associationism and still accept the fact that associative learning does occur. Such was the case with Locke. In fact, Locke's discussion of association came from an afterthought and a short chapter called Association of Ideas. It did not even appear until the 4th edition of the essay. Even then, association was used primarily to explain errors in reason. As we've seen, Locke believes that most knowledge is obtained by actively reflecting on ideas of the mind. By comparing and combining, relating, and otherwise thinking about ideas, we attain our understanding of the world, morality, and ourselves. Where then does association enter? Enter into Locke's deliberations. Locke used association to explain the faculty beliefs that can result from accidents of time or circumstance. Locke called beliefs that resulted from associative learning a degree of madness because they were in opposition to reason. In addition, some ideas that clustered in the mind because of some logical connection among them. Some ideas are naturally associated, such as when the odor of bread baking causes one to have an idea of bread. These are safe and sure types of associations because they are determined by natural relationships. The types of associations that constitute a degree of madness are learned by chance, custom, or mistake. These associations lead to errors in understanding, whereas natural associations do not. Locke believed that ideas that succeeded each other because of the natural and rational reasons represented true knowledge, but the ideas that became associated fortuitously because of their contiguity could result in unreasonable beliefs. As examples of unreasonable beliefs, Locke included the following. A person who eats too much honey becomes sick, and therefore avoids even the thought of honey. Today we call the subsequent avoidance of substance that causes illness the Garcia effect, in honor of the Hispanic-American psychologist John Garcia, who received an APA award for distinguished scientific contribution in 1979 for his research on such phenomena. A child whose maid associates darkness with evil spirits and goblins will grow up with a fear of darkness. A person undergoing painful surgery will develop an aversion to surgery, and children who are taught reading as harsh corrective methods will develop a lifelong aversion to reading. Following Driver's 1968 definition of associationism as an attempt to reduce all mental activity to associated principles, Locke's philosophy certainly did not exemplify associationism. Although this short chapter on association of ideas, did mention that learning of natural associations, he focuses on the learning of those that are unnatural. As we shall see from the British empiricists and French sensationalists who followed Locke, and laws of associations took on greater significance in their efforts to become Newtons of the mind. They argued that ideas corresponding to Boyle's corpuscles and that the laws of association provided the gravity that held ideas together. Education. Locke's book, Some Thoughts Concerning Education, had a profound and long-lasting influence on education thought throughout the Western world. By insisting that nature, or experience, was much more important than, by insisting that nurture, experience, was much more important than nature, innate ability, for character development. His views on education were in accordance with the empirical philosophy. For Locke, important education took place both at home and at school. He encouraged parents to increase stress tolerance in their children, a process called hardening, by having them sleep on hard rather than soft beds. What? Okay. Exposing children to moderate amounts of coldness and wetness would also increase tolerance for inevitable hardships in life. Crying should be discouraged with physical punishment, and if necessary, parents should provide their children with sufficient sleep, food, fresh air, and exercise because good health and effective learning are inseparable. Concerning classroom practices, mild physical punishment of students was advocated, but severe physical punishments was not. Teachers, Locke believed, should always make the learning experience as pleasant as possible, so learning beyond school will be sought. If learning occurred under adversive conditions, it will be avoided both in school and beyond. A step-by-step approach to teaching complex topics was recommended to avoid overwhelming and thus frustrating students. For the same reason, excessive and overly rigorous assignments should be avoided. The primary job of the teacher was to recognize and praise students' accomplishments. So how does one deal with child's irrational fears? Locke used a child with a fear of frogs to exemplify his technique. Your child shrieks and runs away at the sight of a frog. Let another catch it and lay it down at a good distance from him, and at first accustom him to look upon it. When he can do that, then come nearer to it, and see it leap without emotion. Then to touch it lightly when it's held fast in another's hands, and so on, and he can come to handle it confidently as a butterfly or a sparrow. By the same way of any other vain terrors may be removed. Care be taken that you go not too fast. Push the child on to a new degree of assurance till he be thoroughly confirmed in the former. The advice given by Locke for dealing with irrational fears is remarkably similar to the kind of behavior therapy employed many years later by Mary Cover Jones. With the exception of teaching stress tolerance, Locke's ideas concerning education now appear rather routine. They were, however, anything but routine when he first proposed them. Government by the people, for the people. Although for us, he is a patriarch of British empiricism, Locke likely saw himself as a political philosopher. Locke attacked not the notion of innate ideas, but also the notion of innate moral principles. He believed that much dogma was built on the assumption of one innate moral truth or another, and that people should seek the truth for themselves rather than having it imposed on them. For this and other reasons, empiricism was considered to be a radical movement that sought to replace religion based on revelation with natural law. Influential politicality politically, Locke challenged the divine right of kings and proposed a government by and for the people. His political writings on liberty and social contract were read enthusiastically, and his ideas were influenced by the drafting of the U.S. Declaration of Independence. George Berkeley, in 1685 and 1753, was born in Kilkenny, Ireland. He first attended Kilkenny College, Then at 1700, at the age of 15, he entered Trinity College, where he earned a bachelor's degree, which is University of Dublin, where he earned a bachelor's degree in 1704. At the age of 19, his master's degree in 1707 at the age of 22. He received ordination as a deacon of an Anglican church at the age of 24, and that same year published an essay towards the new theory of vision in 1709. A year later, he published what was perhaps his most important work, the Treatise Concerning the Principles of Human Knowledge, in 1710. His third major work, Three Dialogues between Hylas and Philonius, was published during his first trip to England in 1713. Berkeley's fame was firmly established by these three books before he was 30 years old. He continued at Trinity College and lectured in divinity and Greek philosophy until 1724, when he became involved in the founding of a new college in Bermuda intended for both native and white colonial Americans. And in 1728, he sailed to Newport, Rhode Island, where he waited for funding for his project. The hoped-for government grants were not forthcoming. However, Berkeley returned to London. Berkeley's home in Whitehall, near Newport, still stands as a museum containing artifacts of his visit to colonial America. For the last 18 years of his life, Berkeley was an Anglican bishop for Cloyne in County Cork, Ireland. He died suddenly on January 14, 1753 at Oxford, where he had been helping his son enroll as an undergraduate. Just over 100 years later, the site of the first University of California campus was named for Bishop Berkeley. Berkeley observed the downfall of scholasticism caused by the attacks on Aristotle's philosophy had resulted in widespread religious skepticism, if not actual atheism. He also noted that the new philosopher of materialism was further deteriorating the foundations of religious belief, the worldview created by materialistic philosophy. Berkeley felt that all matter is atomic or corpuscular in nature, and that all physical events could be explained in terms of mechanical laws. The world becomes nothing but matter in motion, and the motion of moving objects is explained by natural laws, which is expressible in mathematical terms. Berkeley correctly perceived a materialistic philosophy that was pushing God farther and further out of the picture, and thus it was dangerous, if not potentially fatal, to both religion and morality. Berkeley therefore decided to attack materialism at its very foundations, its assumption that matter existed. To be is to be perceived. Berkeley's solution to the problem was bold and sweeping. He attempted to demonstrate that matter does not exist, and that all claims made by materialistic philosophy must therefore be false. In Berkeley's denial of matter, he both agreed and disagreed with Locke. He agreed with Locke that human knowledge is based only on ideas. However, Berkeley strongly disagreed with Locke's contention that all ideas are derived from form interactions with the empirical world. Even if there were such a world, Berkeley said, we could never know it directly. All things come into existence when they are perceived, and therefore reality consists of our perceptions and nothing more. In his discussion of primary and secondary qualities, Berkeley referred to the former as as supposed attributions of physical things, and the latter as ideas or perceptions. Having made distinction, he then rejected the existence of primary qualities. For him, only secondary qualities, perceptions, existed. This, of course, follows from his contention that to be is to be perceived. Berkeley argued that materialism could be rejected because there was no physical world. Of course, Berkeley's contention that everything that exists is a perception raises several questions. For example, if reality is only a matter of perception, does reality cease to exist when one is not perceiving it? And on what basis can it be assumed that reality one person perceives is the same reality the other person perceives? First, we must realize that Berkeley did not deny the existence of external reality. Okay. What he did deny was the external reality consisted of inert matter, as the materialist maintained. I do not argue against the existence of any one thing that we can apprehend, either by sense or reflection. That all things I see with my eyes and touch with my hands do exist, really exist, I make not the least question. The only thing whose existence we deny is that which philosophers call matter, corporal substance. What creates external reality is God's perception. It is the fact that external reality is God's perception and what makes it stable over time, and the same for everyone. The so-called laws of nature are ideas in God's mind. And on rare occasion, God may change his mind and thus vary the laws of nature, creating miracles. But most of the time, his perceptions remain the same. What we experience through our senses, then, are the ideas in God's mind. With experience, the idea in our minds comes to resemble those in God's minds, in which case it is said that we are accurately perceiving external reality. To be is to be perceived, and God perceives the physical world, thus giving it existence. We perceive God's perceptions, thus giving those perceptions life in our minds as ideas. If secondary qualities are understood as ideas, those existence depends on a perceiver, and all reality consists of secondary qualities. Principle of association. According to Berkeley, each sense modality furnishes a different and separate type of information about an object. It is only through experience that we learn that certain ideas are always associated with a specific object. By sight, I have the idea of light and colors, and there are several degrees and variations. By touch, I perceived hard and soft, heat and cold, motion and resistance, and all of these more and less either as to the quantity or degree. Smelling furnishes me with odors, and the palate with tastes, and the hearing conveys sounds to the mind in all a variety of tone and composition. And several of these are observed to accompany each other, and they come marked by one name, and so to be reputed as one thing. Thus, for example, a certain color, taste, smell, figure, and consistence have been observed to go together are accounted one distinct thing, signifies the name, apple, and collection of ideas, and constitutes a tone, a tree, a book, and like sensible things, which, as they are pleasing or disagreeable, excite the passions of love, hatred, joy, grief, and so forth. Thus, the objects we name are aggregates of sensations that typically accompany each other. Like Locke, Berkeley accepted that the law of contiguity and his associative principle, and unlike Locke, however, he did not focus on the fortuitous or arbitrary associations. For Berkeley, all sensations are consistently experienced together, become associated. In fact, for Berkeley, objects were aggregates of sensations and nothing more. Berkeley's theory of distance perception. Berkeley agreed with Locke that if a person who was born blind was later able to see, he or she would not be able to distinguish a cube from a triangle. Such discrimination requires an association of visual and tactile experiences. Berkeley went further by saying that such a person would also be incapable of perceiving distance. The reason is the same. For the distance of an object to be judged properly, many sensations must be associated. For example, when viewing an object, the person receives tactile stimulation while walking to it. After several such experiences from the same and from different distances, our visual characteristics of an object alone suggest its distance. That is, when an object is small, it suggests greater distance. When it is large, it suggests a shorter distance. Thus, the cues for distance are learned through the process of association. Also, stimulation from other sense modalities become a cue for distance in the same reason. Berkeley gave the following example. Sitting in my study, I hear a coach drive along the street. I look through the casement and I see it. I walk out and I enter into it. Thus, common speech would incline one to think I've heard, saw, and touched the same thing, to wit, the coach is nevertheless certain the ideas intromitted by each sense were widely different and distinct from each other, but, having been observed constantly, go together. They are spoken of as one of the same thing. By the variation of the noise, I perceive a different distances of the coach, and that it approaches before I look out. Thus, by the ear I perceive distance just after the same manner as I do with my eye. With this empirical theory of distance perception, Berkeley was refuting the theory held by Descartes, and others that distance perception was based on geometry and optics. According to the latter theory, a triangle is formed with the distance between the two eyes at its base and the object fixed at its apex. Distant objects formed a long, narrow triangle, and nearby objects form a shorter, broader triangle. Also, the apex of a triangle will vary directly with the distance of the object attended to. The greater the distance, the greater the angle, and vice versa. The convergence and divergence of the eyes are important to this theory, but only because it is such a movement of the eyes that creates geometry of distance perception. According to Berkeley, the problem with the theory of distance perception based on natural geometry is that people simply do not perceive distance in that way. The convergence and divergence of the eyes are extremely important in Berkeley's analysis, but not because of the visual angles that such movement created. Rather, they were important because the sensations caused by the convergence and divergence of the eyes became associated with other sensations that became cues for distance. And first, it is certain by experience that when we look at a nearby object with both eyes, according as it approaches or recedes from us, we alter the disposition of our eyes by lessening or widening the interval between the pupils. This disposition or turn of the eyes is intended with the sensation, which seems to me to be that which is the case brings the idea of greater or lesser distance to mind. The analysis of perception of magnitude or size is the same as for distance perception. In fact, meaning that the word has determined by the sensation, that any word that is determined by the sensations that typically accompany that word. As we see distance, so we see magnitude. And we see both in the same way that we see shame or anger in the looks of a man. Those passions are themselves invisible. They are nevertheless let in by the eye, along with colors, altercations, and countenance, which are immediate object of vision, which signify them for no reason than barely because they have been seen, observed to accompany them, without which experience we should no more have taken blushing for a sign of shame than of gladness. Berkeley's empirical account of perception and meaning was a milestone in psychology's history, because it showed how all complex perceptions should be understood as compounds of elementary sensations, such as sight, hearing, and touch. Atherton, in 1990, proves a more detailed account of Berkeley's theory of perception and a justification of referring to it as revolutionary. David Hume, born in Edinburgh, Scotland. David Hume, 1711 to 1776, was educated at the University of Edinburgh, where he studied law and commerce, but left without a degree. Given relative freedom by an inheritance, Hume moved to La Fleche in France, where Descartes had studied as a young man. It was at La Fleche that Hume, before the age of 28, wrote his most famous book, Treatise of Human Nature, being an attempt to introduce the experimental method of reasoning into moral subjects. The first volume, which was published in 1739, and the second volume, 1740, about his treatise, Hume said, it fell dead born from the press without reaching such distinction as even to excite a murmur among the zealots. In 1742, Hume published his philosophical essays, which was well received. Hume was always convinced that the treatise was poorly received because of its manner of perception rather than its content. And in 1748 published an abbreviated version of the treatise entitled Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. Much of what follows was based on the posthumous 1777 edition of Inquiry. Unlike many of other philosophers of his time, Hume was never a university professor. He worked briefly in commerce before becoming a private tutor, a librarian, and professional secretary. He was nominated for an academic position twice, but the opposed of the Scottish clergy denied him the post. Hume was skeptical of most religious beliefs, and friction about the church was a constant theme in his life. About religion, Hume said, the whole was a riddle, an enigma, an inexplicable mystery. Doubt, uncertainty, suspense of judgment appear the only result of our most accurate scrutiny concerning the subject. Hume argued that religion was both irrational and impractical. He certainly wasn't better. In the first place, fear of God and the expectations of an afterlife have less day-to-day effect upon the conduct than is generally supposed. In the second place, religions do positive harm. They invert moral sins like suicide, which have no natural depravity, and they create frivolous merits, which partake in no natural good, like abstaining from certain foods or attending ceremonies. Moreover, religions result in cruel prosecutions, bigotries, strife between sects, or between sex and civil power. The hunting down of unorthodox opinions. Although, preach, you know what I'm saying, guys? That's all valid. My opinion. Carry on then. However, the end of his life. Hume left the manuscript for his dialogues concerning natural religion with his friend, a famous economist, Adam Smith, with the understanding that Smith would arrange for its publication. However, when Hume died in 1776, Smith, perhaps fearing reprisal against himself, advised against the publication of the book. It did not appear until 1779, then without the publisher's name. Hume's goal. According to Hume, it is evident that all sciences have a relation, greater or less, to human nature. That is, however wide of them they may seem to run from, they still return back one passage for another. Under the heading of science, Hume included such topics as mathematics, natural philosophy, physical science, religion, logic, morals, criticism, politics, and in other words, as with Locke there before, it was seen that all important matters reflect human nature, and understanding that nature is therefore essential. And developing his science of man, Hume followed in the empirical traditions of Occam, Bacon, Hobbes, Locke, and Berkeley. As the science of man is the only solid foundation for the other sciences, so the only solid foundation we can give to science itself must be laid on experience and observation. Hume, however, was very impressed by the achievements of Newtonian science, and he wanted to do for moral philosophy what Newton had done for natural philosophy. Hume believed that he could bring about the reform of moral philosophy, comparable to Newtonian revolution in physics, by following the very method of inquiry that Newton had followed. He aspired to be the Newton of moral sciences. His achievement would in fact surpass Newton's. The science of man is not only indispensable foundation of natural philosophy, but it is also of greater importance and much superior in utility. In Hume's day, moral philosophy referred to roughly to what we now call social sciences, or natural philosophy referred to what we now call in Hume's day, moral philosophy referred to roughly what we now call the social sciences, and natural philosophy referred to what we now call physical sciences. Got it. Besides being an empirical scientist, the science of man would also be an experimental science, because experiments were useful in the physical sciences. They have also to be used in the science of man. However, Hume did not employ experiments in his science of man the same way that they were employed by physical scientists. For the physical scientists, the experiment involved purposely manipulating some environmental variable and noting the effect of the manipulation on the other variable. Both variables were observable and measurable, and we will see the major determinants of behavior in Hume's system were cognitive, not directly observable. For Hume, the term experience meant mental experience. And then he could term experiment. What then could the term experiment mean to Hume? By experiment, Hume meant careful observation of how experiences were related to one another and how experiences related to behavior. Hume noted that his experimental science of human nature would be different from the physical sciences, but different did not mean inferior. Hume's goal then was to combine the empirical philosophy of his predecessors with the principles of Newtonian science and in the process create the science of human nature. It is iconic that with all Hume's admiration for Newton, Hume tended to use Baconian inductive method more so than Newtonian deductive method. More than the Newtonian deductive method. The major thrust of Hume's approach was to make careful observations and then carefully generalize those observations. Hume occasionally did formulate a hypothesis and test it against experience, but his emphasis was clearly on induction rather than deduction. Impressions and ideas. Impressions and ideas. Like the other empiricists that preceded him, Hume believed that contents of the mind came only from experience. Also, like his predecessors, he believed that experience or perception could be stimulated by either internal or external events. Hume agreed with Berkeley that we never experience the physical directly and have only perceptions of it. It is a question of fact whether the perceptions of the senses be produced by external objects resembling them. How shall this question be determined? By experience, surely. All of these other questions, questions of a like nature. But here experience is and must be entirely silent. But here experience is and must be entirely silent. The mind has never anything present to it, but the perceptions cannot possibly reach any experience of their connection with objects. The supposition of connection, I don't know why they put an X in there, is therefore without any foundation in reasoning. Hume did not deny the existence of physical reality. He denied the possibility of knowing it directly. Although the ultimate nature of physical reality must necessarily remain obscure, its existence, according to Hume, must be assumed in all rational deliberations. 'Tis in vain to ask whether there is a body or not. That is a point which we must take for granted in all of our reasonings. Hume distinguished between impressions, which are strong, vivid perceptions, and ideas, which were relatively weak perceptions. Okay. All perceptions of the human mind resolve themselves into two distinct kinds, which I shall call impressions and ideas. The difference betwixt these consists of degrees of force and liveliness with which they strike upon the mind, make their way into our thoughts or consciousness, whose perceptions which enter the most force and violence we may name impressions. Those perceptions which enter with the most force and violence we call impressions, and under this name I comprehend all of our sensations, passions, and emotions, as they make their first appearance in the soul. By ideas, I mean the faint images of these in thinking and reasoning. Okay. Simple and complex ideas and the imagination. Hume made the same distinction that Locke had made between simple ideas and complex ideas. Although, according to Hume, all simple ideas were once impressions, and not all complex ideas necessarily corresponded with complex impressions. Once ideas exist in the mind, they can be rearranged in an almost infinite number of ways by the imagination. Nothing is more free than the imagination of man. And though it cannot exceed the original stock of ideas, furnished by the internal and external senses, it has limited power of mixing, compounding, and separating, then dividing these ideas in all varieties of fiction and vision. It can feign a certain train of events, with all appearance of reality, ascribe to them a particular time and place, conceive them as existent, and paint them out to itself with every circumstance that belongs to a historical fact, which it believes with the greatest certainty, wherein therefore consists of difference between such a fiction and belief. It lies not merely in any particular idea, which is annexed to such a conception of commands, our assent, in which is wanting to every known fiction. For as the mind has authority over all its ideas, it could voluntarily annex this particular idea to any fiction, and consequently be able to believe whatever it pleases, contrary to what we find in the daily experience. We can, in our conception, join the head of man to the body of horse, but it is not in our power to believe that such an animal has ever really existed. It is interesting to note that for Hume, ideas have been consistently experienced together, create the belief that one will follow the other. Such beliefs for us constitute reality. Ideas simply explored by the imagination do not have the history of concordance, and therefore do not elicit a strong belief that one belongs to another, like blue banana. What distinguishes fact from fantasy, then, is a degree of belief that one's idea belongs to another, and such belief is determined only by experience. Again, the contents of the mind come only from experience. Once again, the mind ideas can be rearranged at will. Therefore, we can ponder thoughts that do not necessarily correspond to reality. Hume gave an idea of God as an example. The idea of God as meaning an infinitely intelligent, wise, and good being arises from reflecting on the operations of our own mind and augmenting without limit those qualities of goodness and wisdom. To understand Hume, it is important to remember that all human knowledge is based on simple impressions. Hume stated this fact in the form of a general proposition. All of our simple ideas in their first appearance are derived from simple impressions which are correspondent to them, and which they exactly represent. Association of ideas. If ideas were combined only in the imagination, they would be loose and unconnected, and chance alone would join them together. Also, the association among ideas would be different for each person because there would be no reason for them to be similar. Hume, however, observed that this is not among the associations of all humans, and this similarity must be explained. Hume considered his account of the association of ideas in one of his greatest achievements. If anything can entitle the author to so glorious a name as that of an inventor, it is the use he makes of the principle of association of ideas which enters into most of his philosophy. Hume seems to have overlooked the fact that the laws of association go back at least as far as Aristotle and were employed by Hobbes, to a lesser extent by Locke, and extensively by Berkeley. It is true, however, that Hume depended on the principles of association to the point where his philosophy can be said to exemplify associationism. For Hume, the laws of association do not cement ideas together so that their association becomes immutable. As we have already seen, the imagination can reform ideas in the mind into almost any configuration. Rather, Hume saw the laws of association as a gentle force which creates certain associations as opposed to others. Hume discussed 3 laws of association that influence our thoughts. The law of resemblance states that our ideas run easily from one idea to other similar ideas, such as when thinking of one friend stimulates the recollection of other friends. The law of contiguity states that when one thinks of an object, there is a tendency to recall other objects that were experienced at the same time, and place as the object is being pondered, such as when remembering the gift stimulates the thought of the giver. The law of cause and effect states that when we think of an outcome or an effect, we also tend to think about events that typically precede that outcome, such as when we see lightning and consequently expect thunder. According to Hume, there is no relation which produces a stronger connection in the fancy and makes one idea more readily recall another than the relation of cause and effects betwixt their objects. Because Hume considered cause and effect to be the most important law of association, we will examine it in more detail. Analysis of causation. From time to time, Aristotle, through scholasticism and to the science of Hume's day, it was believed that certain causes, by their very nature, produce certain effects. To make the statement A causes B was to state something that essences of A and B, that is, were assumed to be a natural relation between the two events, so knowing A would allow for the prediction of B. This prediction would be made from knowing the essences of A and B without having observed 2 events together. Hume completely disagreed with the analysis of causation. For him, we can never know that 2 events occur together unless we have experienced them occurring together. In fact, for Hume, causal relationship is consistently observed. Is consistently observed relationship and nothing more. Causation, then, is not a logical necessity. It is a psychological experience. It was not Hume's intention to deny existence of causal relationships, thereby undermine science, which searches for them. Rather, Hume attempted to specify what is meant by causal relationships and how beliefs in such relationships develop. Hume described the observations that need to be made in order to conclude that 2 events are causally related. 1. Cause and effect must be contiguous in space and contiguous in space and time, whatever. 2, cause must be prior to effect. And 3, there must be a constant union betwixt the cause and effect. It is chiefly this quality that constitutes the relation. The same cause always produces the same effect, and the same effect never arises but from the same cause. Thus, it is on the basis of consistent observations that causal inferences are drawn. Predictions based on such observations assume that what happens in the past will continue to happen in the future. But there is no guarantee that that will be the case. What we operate with is the belief that relationships observed in the past will continue to exist in the future. Belief. Also, even if all conditions listed above are met, we could still be incorrect in drawing a causal inference, such as when we conclude that sunset causes the sunrise because one always precedes the other and one never occurs without the other first occurring. According to Hume, then, it is not rationality that allows us to live effective lives, but it is the cumulative experience or what Hume called custom. Custom, then, is a great guide for human life. It is that principle alone which renders our experience useful to us, that makes us expect for the future, and similar train of events with those which have appeared in the past. Without the influence of custom, we should be entirely ignorant of every matter of fact beyond what is immediately present in the memory and senses. We should never know how to adjust means to ends, or to employ our natural powers of production of any effect. There would be an end at once of all action as being the chief part of speculation. Analysis of the mind and the self. As mentioned in Chapter 1, a persistent problem throughout psychology's history has been to account for the unity of experience. Although we are confronted with a myriad of changing situations, our experience maintains all continuity over time and across conditions. The entities that most often have been postulated to explain the unity of experience are mind and a self. All beliefs, according to Hume, result from reoccurring experiences as they are explained by the laws of association. All metaphysical entities such as God, soul, and matter are products of imagination and are so-called laws of nature. Hume expended his skepticism to conclude the concept of mind that was so important to so many philosophers, including Descartes and Locke and Berkeley. According to Hume, the mind is no more than a perception we are having in any given moment. We may observe what we call a mind is nothing but a heap or a collection of different perceptions united together in certain relations, and supposed to thou falsely to be endowed with a perfect simplicity and identity. There is no mind independent of perceptions. There is also no self independent of perceptions. For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or another of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception. I never can observe anything but perception. But my perceptions are removed for any time as by sound sleep, so long as I am insensible of myself, and may truly be said not to exist. And were all my perceptions removed by death, and I could neither think, nor feel, nor see, nor love, nor hate, but after the dissolution of my body, I should be entirely annihilated. The emotions and behavior. Hume pointed out that throughout human history, humans have the same passions or emotions, and that these passions have motivated similar behaviors. It is universally acknowledged that there is a great uniformity among the actions of men in all nations and ages, and that human nature remains still the same in its principles and operations, and the same motives always produce the same action, and the same events follow the same causes: ambition, avarice, self-love, vanity, friendship, generosity, public spirit. These passions, mixed with various degrees and distribution through society, have been from the beginning of the world, and still are, the source of all actions and enterprises which have been observed among mankind. Hume noted that even though all humans possess the same passions, they do not do so in the same degree, because different individuals possess different passions and different patterns of passions. They will respond differently to situations. The patterns of passions that a person possesses determines his or her character, and it is the character that determines the behavior. and it is the person's character that allows for his or her consistent interactions with people. And it is through individual experiences that certain impressions and ideas become associated with certain emotions. And it is the passions elicited by these impressions and ideas, however, that will determine one's behavior. This is another application of laws of association. Only in this case, the associations are between various experiences and the passions, and between passions and behavior. In general, we can say that individuals will seek experiences associated with pleasure and avoid experiences associated with pain. In fact, that human behavior is, at times, inconsistent does not mean that it is free any more than the weather being sometimes unpredictable means that the weather is free. Internal principles and motives may operate in a uniform manner, notwithstanding the seeming irregularities in the same manner as the winds, rain, clouds, and other variation of weather are supposed to be governed by steady principles, although not easily discoverable by human sagacity and inquiry. Humans learn how to act in different circumstances, the same way non-human animals do through experience of reward and punishment. In both cases, reasoning ability has nothing to do with it. This is evident from the effect of disciple and education on animals, who by the proper application of reward and punishment may be taught as a course of action and most contradictory to their natural instincts and propensities. It is not experience which renders dogs apprehensive to pain when you menace him or lift him up or beat him, lift up the whip to beat him. It is not even experience which makes him answer to his name and infer such an arbitrary sound that you mean him rather than any of his fellows, and intend to call him when you pronounce it in a certain manner and with a certain tone and accent. Animals, therefore, are not guided in these inferences by reason. Neither are children. Neither are the generality of mankind in their ordinary actions and conclusions. Neither are philosophers themselves, who in all active parts of life are, in the main, and the same with vulgar, and are governed by the same maxims. It is not ideas or impressions that cause behavior, but the passions associated with those ideas and impressions. It is for this reason Hume said that we speak not strictly and philosophically when we talk of the combat of passion, and of reason. Reason is and ought only to be the slave of passion, and can never pretend to be any other office than to serve and obey them. Hume's influence. So, like Locke, Hume vastly increased the importance of what we now call psychology. In fact, he reduced politics, philosophy, religion, and science to psychology. Everything that humans know is learned from experience. All beliefs are simply expectations that events that have been correlated in the past will remain correlated in the future. Such beliefs are not rationally determined, nor can they be rationally defined. They result from experience. We can have faith only that what we have learned from experience will be applicable in the future. According to Hume, then, humans can be certain of nothing. It is for this reason that Hume is sometimes referred to as the supreme skeptic. Hume accepted two types of knowledge, demonstrative and empirical. Demonstrative knowledge relates ideas to ideas, such as in mathematics. Such knowledge is true only by accepted definitions and does not necessarily say anything about facts or objects outside the mind. demonstrative knowledge is entirely abstract and is entirely the product of imagination. That is not to say that demonstrative knowledge is useless, because the relation gleaned in arithmetic, algebra, and geometry are this type and represent clear and precise thinking. Such knowledge, however, is based entirely on deduction from one idea to another. Therefore, it does not necessarily say anything about the empirical events. Conversely, empirical knowledge is based on experience, and it alone can furnish knowledge that can effectively guide the conduct in the world. According to Hume, for knowledge to be useful, it must be either demonstrative or empirical. If it is neither, it is not real knowledge and therefore is useless. When we run over libraries, persuaded of these principles, what havoc must we make? If we take in our hand any volume of divinity or school metaphysics, for instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact or existence? No. Commit it to the flames, for it cannot contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. Hume's insistence on all propositions must be either demonstrably or empirically true places him in a clearly positivistic tradition of Bacon. We will have more to say about positivism later on in this chapter. David Hartley, 1705 to 1757. The son of a clergyman, had completed his training as a minister at the University of Cambridge before an interest in biology caused him to seek a career as a physician. Hartley remained deeply religious all of his life, believing that understanding natural phenomenon increased one's faith in God. It took several years for Hartley to write his long, difficult Observation of Man, his Fame, his Duty, and his Expectations in 1749. This ponderous book is divided into two parts. The first part concerning the human frame, containing his contributions to psychology, and the second part concerning his duty and expectations of humans, almost totally theological. Hartley's goal. Although Hartley's observations appeared several years after Hume's Treatise on Human Nature, Hartley had been working on his book for many years, and appears not to have been influenced by Hume. His two major influences were Locke and Newton. Hartley accepted Newton's contention that nerves are solid, not hollow, as Descartes had believed, that all sensory experience caused vibrations in the nerves. The vibrations were called impressions. The impressions reached the brain and caused vibrations of infinitesimal medullary particles, which caused sensations. Newton had also observed that vibrations in the brain show a certain inertia, that is, that they continue vibrating after the impressions cause them to cease. This, according to Newton, was why we see a whirling piece of coal as a circle of light. For Hartley, it was the lingering vibrations in the brain following the sensation that constituted ideas. Ideas, then, were faint replications of senses. Hartley's goal was to synthesize Newton's conception of nerve transmission by vibration with previous versions of empiricism, especially Locke's. This union was the most pressing question of philosophy, and most contemporary ideas of physiology would become the hallmark of psychology. Hartley's explanation of association. As we have seen, Hartley believed that sense impressions produced vibrations in the nerves, which traveled to the brain and caused similar vibrations in the medullary substance of the brain. Medullary substance of the brain. The brain vibrations caused a sense impression to give rise to sensations. After sense impressions cease, they remain there remain in the brain diminutive vibrations that Hartley called vibronauticles. These vibronauticals that correspond to ideas. Ideas are weaker copies of sensations. Vibronauticals are like the brain vibrations associated with sensations in every way except the vibronauticals are weaker. So, for how sense impressions cause ideas. Now, the question is, how do ideas become associated? Any sensations, A, B, or C, by being associated with one another a sufficient number of times, get such power over the corresponding ideas, A, B, C, that any one sensation A, then expressed alone, shall be able to excite the mind, B, C, and the ideas of the rest. Hartley's notion that experiences occurring together are recorded in the brain as interrelated package, that experiencing is one element of the package that will make one conscious of the entire package, is remarkably modern, as we see with Donald Hebb in chapter 18. Although Hartley distinguished between simultaneous and successive associations, both are examples of the law of contiguity. Successive experiences follow each other closely in time, and simultaneous events occur the same way. Both exemplify the type of contiguity. What made Hartley's account of association significantly different from previous accounts was his attempt to correlate all mental activity with neurophysiological activity. Unlike Locke, who believed that complex ideas are formed from single ideas via reflection, Hartley believed that all complex ideas are formed automatically by processes of association. For Hartley, there were no active mind processes involved at all. Simple ideas that were associated by contiguity form complex ideas. Similarly, complex ideas that are associated with contiguity become associated into decomplex ideas. By simple ideas combine into complex ideas, and complex ideas combine to form decomplex ideas. It may be difficult to remember the individual sensations that make up such ideas. However, for Hartley, all ideas, no matter how complex, are made up of sensations. And furthermore, association is the only process responsible for converting simple ideas into complex ones. Laws of association and behavior. Hartley attempted to show so-called voluntary behavior developed from involuntary or reflexive behavior. He also used the law of association to explain how involuntary behavior gradually becomes voluntary, and then becomes almost involuntary or automatic again. Involuntary behavior occurs automatically or reflexively in response to sensory stimulation. Voluntary behavior occurs in response to one's ideas or to stimuli not originally associated with the behavior. The voluntary behavior itself can become so habitual that it too becomes automatic, not unlike involuntary behavior. The basic assumption in Hartley's explanation is that all behavior is first involuntary and gradually becomes voluntary through the process of association. In the following example, we can see that Hartley's explanation of development of voluntary behavior comes very close to what is later called conditioned reflex. The fingers of young children bend upon almost every impression which is made upon the palm of the hand, thus performing the action of grasping in the original automatic manner. After sufficient repetition of the motorary vibrations which occur in this action, their vibronauticals are generated, and associated strongly with other vibrations, or vibronauticals, the most common of which, I suppose, are those excited by the sight of a favorite plaything, which the child uses to grasp, to hold in its hand. He ought therefore, according to the doctrine of association, to perform and repeat the action of grasping upon having such a plaything present in his sight. But it is known fact that children do this. By pursuing the same method of reasoning, we can see after sufficient repetition the proper association of sound of the word grasp, take hold, and the sight of the nurse's hand in a state of contradiction, the idea of the hand, and particularly of the child's own hand in that state, the innumerable other associated circumstances, i.e. sensations, ideas, motions, will put the child upon grasping, till at last the idea or state of mind, which we will call the will to grasp, is generated, and sufficiently associated with the action to produce it instantaneously. It is therefore perfectly voluntary in this case, and by the innumerable repetitions of it in this perfectly voluntary state, it comes at last to obtain sufficient connection with the many diminutive sensations, ideas, motions, as it follows them from the same manner as originally automatic actions do the corresponding sensations, and consequently to the automatic secondarily, and to the same manner may all actions performed with the hand be explained, all those that are very familiar in life, passing through the original automatic state, through the several degrees of voluntariness, till they become perfectly voluntary, and they are passing through the same degree in an invert order, until they become secondary automatic on many occasions, through still perfectly voluntary on some viz. Whensoever an express act of the will is exerted. Thus behavior, first involuntary, and then put into becomes increasingly voluntary, as though the process of association, more and more stimuli become capable of eliciting the behavior. Finally, when performing the voluntary action becomes habitual, it is said to be secondarily automatic. It should be clear that Hartley did not employ the term voluntary as to mean freely chosen. For him, voluntary behavior is determined by the law of contiguity, and therefore no free choice is involved. We see in Hartley's explanation much that would later become part of modern learning theory. Hartley's influence. It was Hartley's discipline, Joseph Priestley, 1733 to 1804, the famous chemist and co-discoverer of oxygen, who explored the implications of Hartley's analysis for education. Priestley wrote Hartley's Theory of the Human Mind on the Principle of Association of Ideas in 1775, which did much to promote the popularity of Hartley's ideas. Hartley took the speculations concerning neurophysiology of the time and used them in his analysis of association. His effort was the first major attempt to explain neurophysiology of thought and behavior since Descartes. The neurophysiological mechanisms that Hartley postulated were largely wrong, but as more became known about neurotransmission and brain mechanisms, the more accurate information replaced the older fictions. Thus Hartley started the search for the biological correlates of mental events that have continued to the present. Earlier in this chapter, associationism was defined as any psychological theory that has association at its fundamental principle. Under this definition, neither Hobbes nor Locke's philosophies qualify. Hume probably qualifies, but Hartley was the first man to whom the term associationist can be applied without qualification. Hartley's brand of associationism became highly influential and was authoritative, and the authoritative psychological account for about 80 years until the time of James Mills.